Do we have too much government? We need to put people ahead of corporate profits. This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
President of Education Minnesota. Welcome to Access to Democracy, Denise.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. So since you are a new guest, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up and where did you go to school, some of the basics?
I'd love to. I grew up in Buffalo, Minnesota, so west of the Minneapolis area. Went to all of my grade school there. I went to college at Moorhead State, Minnesota, in Moorhead, Minnesota, and got my master's degree at St. Cloud State University. So I pleased to have a public education from Minnesota here, and it served me very well.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that not just one, but both of your parents were teachers. Is this what inspired you to become a teacher as well?
They were. I'm a fourth generation educator. So my great grandmother was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in North Dakota. And my great-grandfather was the custodian, so to speak, of the one-room schoolhouse. He kept it warm, he made sure that everything was shoveled, and they lived there during the winter to make sure that it was ready for all of the students that came. My grandfather was a teacher before World War II, and then he came back and became a superintendent. And yes, both my parents, my teaching idols, were teachers. My dad taught high school business, and my mom was a special education teacher.
My goodness, 4 generations of teachers. I guess it was inevitable that you'd end up in the profession.
I love it. It's the greatest career ever.
So you were elected president of Education Minnesota last year. Tell us a little bit about Education Minnesota, how many members you have, who you represent, and what your union does.
Well, Education Minnesota represents 70,000 educators across the state. We represent higher ed members from the Minnesota State college faculty, so all of the MnSCU 2-year career and technical colleges. We also represent faculty at the University of Minnesota Duluth and Crookston, K-12 teachers, and also support staff. So we have bus drivers, custodians, paraprofessionals, teachers, aides, nurses, and we do represent a charter school most recently. So we have a wide variety of educators in our union, and I think that makes us so unique, but also so strong.
I was a little surprised myself when I learned you represented some of the people over at MnSCU, because I think most Minnesotans who've heard of Education Minnesota, they probably think you just represent public school teachers, K through 12.
Right, yeah, I've heard that too, but we're really proud to have a higher education voice in our union and to be part of the work that they do, especially at the community colleges. I mean, they're such an economic engine to our communities, and they're all over, and we love the work that they do.
So a primary responsibility for you as a president of the largest teachers union in Minnesota, obviously, to try to negotiate contracts and benefits for your members. How are you doing at this point? How are negotiations going with our school districts around the state?
Well, we do, our local negotiating teams actually negotiate by themselves. You know, they're doing the work in their school districts. We have about 40 contracts that are out right now. which is a lot. You know, way back a couple, maybe 4 years ago, there used to be a deadline where if you think about like a school assignment or a work assignment, if you have a deadline, you know when you need to get your work done, and deadlines help. But there is no longer a deadline to help our teachers get the contracts, you know, in a reasonable amount of time. So we do have a number that are out, but we're working with them to try to get that, you know, deal done, because we know that it is a distraction. They want to be teaching, they want to be focused on students, and it really is best to have those discussions done quickly.
A few years ago, we were having a real crisis in public education in the state of Minnesota because of the state's financial problems. There was the infamous school funding shift, an issue that I actually worked on with the Service Employees Union. They had an initiative called Our Minnesota Future, and it was trying to put the public spotlight on the costs to taxpayers of the school funding shift, where the state basically was writing IOUs to school districts, and they were not providing 100% of the formula aid that was owed to those school districts. But things have changed quite a bit recently, haven't they? Tell us about where we stand with the school funding shift. That money's been repaid?
That's true, which is something that we're really happy about. So the money that was borrowed out of students' piggy banks has been returned, and that's due to, I think, a couple of things. One is the economy is getting better.
Tax revenues are up, local
Correct.
government tax revenues.
And due to the surpluses, they were able to pay those school districts back. I think it also says a lot about, you know, who is working at the Capitol right now. We have a pro-public education legislature and governor, and we're seeing in the last 2 years an investment in education from early childhood all the way to higher ed, and it has made a huge difference.
And the other thing, it seemed like a few years ago we were seeing school districts, because they were being shortchanged by the state, you were seeing an increasing number of school districts having to go to the voters and request additional money for operating.
Correct.
And so we're seeing less of that now. We're seeing less initiatives for school referenda or levy increases.
We are, I mean, I think we are seeing less, but we still have school districts that have had to make up for 10 plus years of disinvestment. You know, the last 2 years of investing has been very helpful, but you know, it takes a while to get out of that hole. I think the other thing that we have to take a look at is aging buildings and expanding student enrollment, and so many of those asks to the community for buildings and things like that might very well be needed, that just isn't related to the funding and the investment that we've seen.
Denise, I forget which school district it was, but I just saw something in the news, I think a week or two ago, where they're planning to go to the voters to ask for some additional money for technology needs. Because, you know, we live in this computer age, and kids, it's become an integral part of the equipment. You know, back when you and I were in school, it was just, do you have your backpack and your lunch and a notepad and some pencils? But now the kids need to have computers to access the world of the internet and online learning and other things. So we're seeing more of this across Minnesota?
Correct. I mean, you know, the classrooms are not the same when we went to school, when you went to school, when my mother went to school. It's not just textbooks and blackboards anymore. Students are learning with smartboard technology and iPads and smarter tools. And those are expensive, and there's a cost. But if you think about what we do in public schools, we're preparing students for successful lives. We're preparing students for jobs that haven't even been created yet. So it is really important to keep an eye on those needs and make sure that our schools have the things that they need to help students prepare for that.
Listening to some of our political leaders talk, I know there's been a tension between, you know, the additional needs for funding for our schools so that we finance education, so that we make the investment, as you might put it, so that we can be where we need to be for the future. There's been a tension between that versus those who say, well, no, it's more of a priority to hold the line on new taxes and not increase taxes. And, you know, how do you strike that right balance between what voters, taxpayers can afford versus what the needs of our schools are.
Correct, and it is a hard balance, and I think that one of the best things that we can do as a school community is make sure that the community is involved in those decisions and understand the needs of a school and a school district. So we always talk about making sure that we are reaching out to our families and our communities and the businesses in our school community. Bring them in. Don't bring them in when you just need something, but bring them in all of the time so that they are keenly aware of what those needs are, so that they will be supportive.
And I think I had seen in the news somewhere that Education Minnesota actually sponsored a series of community, or you're in the process of doing these community forums. Is that what
We
you call them,
did.
where you go around the state and you gather citizens together and you talk about just this kind of issue?
We did. We did a series of community conversations around the state. We had 6 of them total, and our topic for these conversations was around teacher quality. How do we diversify the education workforce, and how do we attract and retain the best and the brightest into our profession and have them stay? And it was an excellent opportunity for us to listen to everyday Minnesotans, to listen to families and community members and students from all over the state.
So what sorts of things did they say to you?
Well, we heard a lot of things that I think we knew, but it was great to hear again. So things like, we love our public schools. We think our teachers are doing great. But there was also a recognition that I didn't really know was there, is that people recognize there is a lot more stress in education right now. There are a lot of demands in education, and they know that teachers often are vilified or demonized, out in the media and those kinds of things. So there was a recognition that morale was low. I think something that we knew, but it was hard to hear, was that not very many people they love their teachers, but don't want to recommend that their own kids go into
pursue
teaching.
that as a profession.
Right.
That's sad.
Right. So I think that is an eye-opener to, there are some problems, and we do need to talk about that. They talked about, bringing more respect to the profession. They talked about bringing more support and resources so educators can do their jobs, do them well, and stay focused on students.
I mean, when I think of my own childhood and growing up, and I went through the Minneapolis public schools. I graduated from Roosevelt in 1974. I was of a group of people, a generation of Minnesotans, who were beneficiaries of the so-called Minnesota Miracle, when we didn't just fund public education based upon local property tax revenue, but they broadened the sources of revenue to finance education. And I look at that and I'm just so thankful that people in Minnesota cared enough about me and people in my generation that we got a good education.
Yeah.
And my brother and sister and I, all 3 of us went on to college, and we all ended up with graduate degrees. So, laying that base, how important that is. And someone told me once, they said, you get one chance to go through the 5th grade. You get one chance to grow up, really. So it's really important that we have these blocks in place and that our schools are adequately funded and they're running well.
You are absolutely right, and that's why we wanted to hear from Minnesota communities, and that's why we want to make sure that we're bringing what they said to other people, whether it's policymakers or institutions of teacher preparation, those kinds of things. So we're going to be bringing those ideas forward, and it's really exciting to be part of a solution. And try to, fix some of the things that we know are issues right now.
Big issue in education seems whenever you get 2 or more people talking about education reform, the subject of testing comes up. Standardized testing. I'm sure your phone rings off the hook every day with teachers complaining about there are too many tests out there. A lot of parents think that too. Certainly a lot of students do too. But where's the balance between testing enough and testing too much? Where do you see that?
Right. We hear from a lot of people about testing. You are absolutely right. If you go into a school, we hear it all the time. And if you have children at home, you hear it from your kids. We're just getting through the testing season, here in Minnesota with the standardized tests. So it's really, really out in the open right now. We do need a balance. There is excessive testing. There's no doubt about it. We need to be thinking about how we can pare that down, get some good information for educators so that they can be better and know how they can be better, but also make sure that we're getting good information to parents and community members so that they have the accountability that they're looking for as well. Educators are not afraid of accountability, and we want to improve, but when we hear the statistics, and these are proven, that every year a student will go through 1 month of test prep. 1 month of learning taken away to prepare for tests.
That's 1 month that was taken away from instruction.
Correct, and if you add that all up in a whole career in public schools, that's a full year of learning lost because of test preparation. And we also hear too, oh, you don't have to do that, that isn't necessary, but let's face it, the high stakes nature of standardized tests is out there, and there is a lot of pressure there, and it's pressure for the students and the parents and everyone. So we believe that we need to pare back. We believe that we need to be taking a look at everyday assessments. Teachers are looking at their students and watching their growth every single day. And I believe that that is the information that is very valuable to parents. I would be willing to bet that there isn't one parent that doesn't know how their student is doing before they get that standardized test if they're in touch with the teachers.
One issue that's come up too is there have been some people, particularly in communities of color and other critics, who have suggested that some of the standardized tests are culturally or ethnically biased. Do you have an opinion about that? Is some of the tests biased so that the end result might be that children in large minority school districts, the performance on test scores may be skewed downward in part because of this issue about cultural bias in testing? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, bias in testing is a big concern. And I think that one of the tough parts about that, especially when it comes down to the standardized tests, the tests that we give for MCA, for example, there is so much, how can I say this? It's so much of a secret. We don't get to see the test questions. We don't get to talk to students when they take those tests. So as a teacher who wants to be a voice for his or her students and to be able to talk about testing bias when everything is so much of a secret around those tests, a lot of privacy, it's really hard to know what is in it in the first place. So I would say we need to bring more accountability to how the tests are made, who's monitoring those questions, and what the process is.
Speaking of demographics, and that's in part what we're talking about here too, Minnesota is changing. And not just in the core Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, you have significant communities of color and recent immigrant students in places like Austin, Minnesota, Worthington, Minnesota, Greater Minnesota, places that you wouldn't think of as having immigrant populations of students. How is the changing demographics of the student body in Minnesota affecting the teaching profession, and how are teachers adapting to those changes?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. And which is one of the reasons why we had the community conversations that we had, because we know that the teaching workforce does not reflect the ethnic minority and the diversity that we're seeing in classrooms right now. And studies show that students will learn better when they are with people who look like them or who understand their culture and have some of those competencies. So that's one thing that we are also talking about, is how do you provide the proper resources and support to educators so that they can understand cultures and understand the families, new families maybe that are in a community, but also how can we make sure that there are resources out in the communities to help the families of the students that we're working with.
When people hear the term education reform, it seems to trigger some pretty interesting conversations. This past February, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce sponsored a conference on education reform, which I understand you were invited to participate in and did. And it was quite controversial, I understand. They had Michelle Rhee, who is the former chancellor of the District of Columbia school system, which no doubt has had a lot of problems historically over the years. And she's the founder of an organization called Students First, a nonprofit that has a lengthy agenda about what they call their version of education reform. And a lot of it seems aimed at teachers, at teacher evaluations and teacher quality issues, and also on testing issues too. What does education reform mean to you, Denise, as president of the largest teachers union in Minnesota? What are the elements of education reform?
Well, I think that any reform or bringing solutions to the table needs to include a teacher voice. I've seen ideas that have been put forward without the educator's voice at the table have failed. And I think that if we want to see success, if we want to see ideas that are going to really make a difference, let's bring people who are at the grassroots, at the ground level, to the table, which is one of the issues, I think, with the particular conference you're talking about. There were no educators on any panels. There were not teachers invited.
Well, how many parents were there, too? Because wasn't it held during the middle of a workday
It
when
was.
most people are at work?
Yeah, it was. And I think the one thing that I think we should consider here in Minnesota is that solutions and ideas are right here in Minnesota. We heard it in the community conversations we had. We don't need a national agenda to move our schools forward. Let's talk about what works right here in Minnesota, and the ideas are right there, right in front of our faces.
So as you look ahead to the future, where do you think Minnesota schools are headed? What are our schools going to look like, say, 5-10 years down the road? I know I'm asking you to look in the crystal ball, and there's always the risk that, you know, it's sometimes difficult to tell what's going to happen next year or next legislative session, much less 5 or 10 years down the road. But what do you see on the horizon?
Well, I see one thing for sure is what we just discussed, is that demographics are definitely going to be changing. Also, just the traditional way that content is delivered, or the way we are teaching as professionals, are going to change. The integration of technology, for example. But the other thing I think we will see change, which I hope we will see change, is the notion of getting back to a school being the hub of a community. That we will see more of a community-based school system, where a school will be open, from 7 to midnight, not midnight, but maybe 7 to 7. And it might not necessarily mean that we will be teaching there that long, but in the morning there will be support services, early childhood interventions, that there will be health opportunities, doctors, dentists. In the evening there will be opportunities for after-school programs for students.
Or how about adult education?
Adult
too?
education.
Yeah, continuing education.
Right, exactly.
Some of us could use a brush up on our computer skills.
I'm one of those.
Need to become more fluent in modern technology, but things like that.
Right,
too, yeah.
right. So a full-service community school is something that I hope we will see more of.
And what would you say when you look out to teachers right now who say, I just don't think I can keep doing this, that the pay is not where it should be, the amount of the work that teachers are asked to deal with. I mean, I hear this from my sister. My sister happens to teach in the Minneapolis Public Schools. She's done it for 15 years. She started out as a teacher's aide. She's told me the stories about when money was tight, taking money out of her own purse to buy supplies at Target for her kids. That kind of thing shouldn't be happening in a place like Minnesota, or anywhere, should it?
It's happening. I think the latest study is teachers spend up to $500 out of their pocket. And when I first started teaching, it was for things like school supplies. But now teachers are paying for basic needs, food, socks, mittens, those kinds of things. So things are changing there. But I would say to people like that, be part of a solution. Get involved in the decision making in your school. Get involved in your union. Get involved with the PTA. Get involved in your community. because those are the places where we can bring change.
And it seems like when we talk about this issue, education reform, there are so many components to it. There's the issue about teacher quality, teacher competency, but also curriculum development, adequate funding for infrastructure, the schools that we have our kids learning in, that how can they be learning if the heating is falling apart or the roof is falling off the school? So there are a lot of issues that touch this cornerstone issue about education reform and what kind of education our kids are going to get.
You are so right. You know, we in schools need to advocate for having the support and the resources we need to do our work. And we are going to work hard to make sure that our students are prepared for successful lives. But we are not going to be ultimately successful without looking at the opportunity gaps. So we hear a lot about the achievement gap, but we also have to talk about some opportunities and making sure that we lessen those gaps as well. That's why you'll hear Education Minnesota working with community groups more on things like fair housing, fair lending. We got involved in the minimum wage coalition, the bullying bill. It's really
Let's
important.
talk about the bullying one. I'm glad you brought that because I didn't want us to miss this. Why did Education Minnesota get involved in that issue? There were some critics in the legislature, as you well know, who said, we don't need this. We already have laws on the books and school districts have plans. So why was it necessary for the legislature to come back and address this issue again? And they did pass an anti-bullying bill, which Governor Dayton signed. Why was that necessary?
They did. So Minnesota had, now that it's passed, the weakest bullying language in all of the United States. So it was less than 40 words, I think. So it was necessary to strengthen that language. Education Minnesota got involved in the coalition a year ago, and I was really surprised that it did not pass through the legislature in the last session. So when that didn't happen, we made sure that we made it our priority and had a stronger presence in the coalition to get that over the finish line. We all know that students learn better when schools are safe and welcoming, and we wanted to make sure that this bill went over the finish line, and it did, and we're so happy.
What do you say to some of the critics? I heard one legislator, who I cannot recall his name, but he said, well, this is going to infringe on people's First Amendment rights. That if you're going to prosecute somebody or go after them because they've made what they called a politically incorrect mark about someone's ethnicity or affectional preference or something, and that goes too far. What do you say to those critics?
The bill doesn't talk about that, and that is not going to happen. I think we all need to take a deep breath about this, because the school district that you mentioned earlier, really when many districts take a look at this law, many of them are not going to have to change a thing. They already have things in place. They were already addressing many of the issues, but there are some that do need to strengthen that.
We all know there was a very famous story out of the Anoka-Hennepin County School District where there were bullying issues that weren't addressed that resulted in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. So these things, or a settlement that ultimately happened there that cost taxpayers too. So I guess you can either be proactive as the legislature was and admin was in addressing it, or hiding under a rock and pretending it doesn't exist. Denise Specht, President of Education Minnesota, I just want to say it's really been a pleasure to have you on Access today. We hope you'll come back and see us, and we hope you'll tell your members how much we appreciate the great work our teachers do every day, sometimes in very difficult and challenging circumstances, to educate our kids. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.